Hi there, and welcome to this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Tim Miller. G'day, how are you?
Yeah, going pretty well, Aaron. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thank you. Well, today we're going to be talking about LRBAs and not so much around how they're structured, Tim, but more importantly about the conclusion of LRBAs and not necessarily the disposal, but naturally comes into the discussion here. But in a lot of instances where we ultimately have the loan repaid and look to move that asset across to the SMSF. Now, that's not always the case, and I might get you to maybe start there around some of those considerations when the LRBA in the Bear Trust could actually reach its conclusion.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting point. I think the reason, obviously, that you and I wanted to speak about this is because look, these things ultimately came into play in 2000 from 2007, structured more conveniently from 2010, and then we saw a lot of reform around that between 2012 and 2015. And so, in many instances, a lot of these things are reaching the end of their term, particularly those related party ones that were restricted by the PCG, by the safe harbour rules, to 15 years from a payout time. So we're seeing them reaching their conclusion, and so the decision about whether or not to keep the asset, in the Bear Trust, the holding trust name, or to transfer the asset to the self-managed super fund trustee, are all decisions that are now at the forefront of the minds of trustees who have entered into these arrangements. So if you kind of summarize those key points, it's one is, is this asset an asset that we want to retain? Two, which probably becomes before that, is, how are we tracking with our repayments? Are we satisfying all of our repayment requirements? And what impact, potentially through COVID, did we need to make sure that we also satisfied to keep it clean until it's paid out? And then once we decide that we're going to retain the asset, if that's our objective, is how we're going to hold the asset.
Yeah, so one of the things there that I've seen on occasion is the fact that if the decision's to be made to move that asset across, then in particular in the LRBA safe harbour guidance in PCG 2016, we have to make sure that we've kind of cleaned up that as part of the transfer. And what I mean by that is there is a requirement to have a registered mortgage, so we would be expecting that to be removed. There is naturally the fact that there's a number of steps in a legal context that we'd want to ensure that we did correctly when it first happened, so that we didn't end up in a potential double duty situation, or in essence, that transfer across has no duty or a concessional duty ultimately applied to it. So are there any other things there practically that we need to contemplate in moving that across? And then equally, why we may not want to move it, and what we need to understand by retaining that asset inside the Bear Trust, even though we don't actually have a loan attached to it.
Yeah, so let me start there, because I guess there's a couple of key legislative issues there, and that is that one of the concepts that was introduced, it first came in, I think, as a legislative instrument,
Yeah.
but it was the concept that the link to the fact that the Bear Trust could be viewed as a related trust, and so the risk associated with it being considered an in-house asset. And so the legislation was effectively extended by the regulators to say, look, both before and after the loan is in place, right? So when this trust is initially set up, and if it is maintained afterwards, that the trust, if it continues to meet the conditions of 67A, so therefore things like no improvements, all those sorts of other elements as well, then it will continue to be exempt from a definition of an in-house asset. But importantly, there was this capacity to say that there was actually no mandate within the legislation that says you have to transfer the asset out of the trust once the loan is repaid. The caveat being that if you don't transfer it out, then you're always going to be subject to the 67A definition and requirements, like around the improvements and all those sorts of things, changing the nature of the asset, a lot of other key considerations there. But for some people, the decision to not transfer out of the Bear trustee could be linked to, you touched on it before, some issues associated with the initial transaction where it might be dubious, or there might be some sort of stamp duty implication, because potentially maybe they paid deposits personally, and so there's going to be some ownership issues there. And so they say, right, from a cleanliness point of view, we don't want to incur any stamp duty. We don't want to run the risk, so we might look to keep the asset in the holding trust.
Yeah, and that to me is a really important step to understand at that point in time. So if we take a residential property, for example, and they've bought it, there's a house on there, the idea is that it will have future development value. So the reality is well, they will pay down the loan, and then at some point in time, there may be an objective to knock over that, and then maybe looking to build 1, 2, 3 townhouses, whatever it is. So then, as you rightly said, they're going back to the definitions that are sitting within 67A and B around, well, what can or can't you do? And ultimately, if you want to change the character and nature of what was invested in originally, well, then you're not, regardless of whether there's a loan there or not, you're not going to be able to achieve that unless you move that asset back across into the SMSF.
Yeah, that's right, and it's just fundamentally a no-brainer. Like, once you do, if you do that, once you've knocked it down, you've created a problem for yourself. So you want to make sure that you've undertaken the necessary transfer transactions beforehand. And of course, the legislation accommodates that. The whole piece of legislation from inception always accommodated that transfer across from the holding trust to the SMSF trustee.
Yeah, and so I guess finally there, can you think of any other considerations in that exiting, in essence, of the arrangement? Like I said, it could be from the disposal point of view and what needs to be considered in an audit perspective, or simply from the fact of just moving it over and what we might need to do as part of closing off the arrangement that we had in place.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously you mentioned one there being, which is the removal of the registered mortgage over the property is a clear one to be mindful of. I think it's really important to identify what transaction or what decision you're going to make with regards to the ongoing sort of holding of the property, with reference to whether it remains in the holding trust or is moved over to the SMSF trustee, and clearly any necessary paperwork that goes along with that. I don't know if you, from a historical documentation point of view, you've certainly produced a lot more documents than I have in regards to these sorts of things, Aaron, whether there's any document areas that you would focus on.
Yeah, so I think from that point of view, it's not a mandated requirement to have to vest that bed trust, but we do see procedurally that there is an opportunity to do that. So we actually have a vesting document around that to show that closure has occurred. So it's not ingrained within the bare trust deed or the LRB agreement as such. But when people are undertaking that, it's what's the series of documents that supports what has occurred, not only from an SRO point of view to be able to demonstrate what has been happening within the relevant jurisdictions, but again, equally from what we see from a compliance perspective. So what we've done at Smarter SMSF is we've built out a range of documents to be able to support, in essence, that decision, whether it's off the back of a sale and therefore the bare trust is in essence dead and buried at that point in time, or ultimately it's reached a tenure simply by the fact that then we're going through a process of moving that asset into the name of the trustee of the SMSF, rather than through actual ownership and legal ownership, rather than through beneficial ownership.
Yeah, okay. And look, I guess one other thing that's just come to my mind as you talk through that is clearly, what are your future plans? Like, do you if you're going to move the asset across, then what purpose do you have for the company? If you've got a company trustee of that holding trust, like, do you need to look to wind that up as well to avoid future fees and other things, or are you going to potentially enter into further limited recourse borrowing arrangements, and so they're having the holding trust company there is of benefit to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a myriad of things, obviously, that we need to contemplate as part of this. But again, I think from that point of view, it just gives people some ideas and considerations around what needs to be happening. Naturally, people would be taking a review of this process each and every year. And I think, Tim, just to sort of finish that off, the investment strategy then becomes a part of it as well. So review at this point would be a natural part of the overall process, because we're now really focusing on inflows coming into the fund, because we're not necessarily going to be having the outflows anymore, on the basis that that loan will have been repaid if that asset is actually moving across to the fund as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you once again for talking to the topic of LRBAs in this week's Feeling Smarter. Have a great rest of the week, everyone. Take care and bye for now.
See you all.